and it's entitled Engines for Growth, and it's about future of space exploration. And so we've got Mark Ciotola here, and for those who weren't here earlier, I'll just remind you, he's worked with NASA for a number of years and worked with a number of high-profile industries around Silicon Valley in America, and is also affiliated quite strongly with the Singularity University, which he told you about before. But this talk is mainly about the future of space exploration. So put your hands together for Mark Ciotola. Thanks, Mark.
I'm sorry to kill the lights, but with space people expect nice pictures. Also, I'm used to presenting in Planetaria, which are great because people want to see my 510, and if people take naps, I don't feel so bad because it's hard, you know, for my talk. Let's say I wanted to kind of get things running. You just had a break, so your energy level's high, and so I wanted to run with that. And so a couple interns at NASA produced kind of a spoof, but this has some great shots of Johnson Space Center. The sound will be off of this computer.
NASA Johnson Star. Johnson Star. Welcome to NASA's Johnson Space Center. We are coming in hot, so don't burn up as we enter. We do science every day that affects your daily life. Throw them up for manned spaceflight. Science everywhere as we engineer the marvels that fly through the air and take us way beyond Earth's level. Science everywhere because we engineer the marvels that fly through the air, flies us through the air. Control the mission of Johnson. This is ground. This is space. So we use the. What's the problem? It's okay. Oh, it's okay. Because the flight controllers are in Johnson now. NASA Johnson Star. Johnson Star. NASA Johnson Star. Johnson Star. NASA Johnson Star. Science Navy. NASA Johnson Star. It's amazing. NASA Johnson Star. Orbiting Earth International Space Station, where we work and live in space with a crew from several nations. Got Japanese and Russians and that European charm. Going up like the Canada arm. Kicking out research. 29 cubic feet revolves around the Earth. Science microgravity revolves around the Earth. Columbus jamming destiny. Kicking out research. Kicking out research. We're the Astro. NASA Johnson to go to space. To go to space. Cause the missions are tomorrow. Start today. Start today. As we engineer the future day. NASA Johnson Star. Johnson Star. NASA Johnson Star. Johnson Star. NASA Johnson Star. Science Navy. NASA Johnson Star. It's amazing. NASA Johnson Star. SLS and PCV, we cannot view the floor, cause the lack of gravity the destinations are. An asteroid Mars or the moon we are blasting off, start the countdown soon. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Science Navy. NASA Johnson Star. NASA Johnson Star.
Okay, that pretty much sums it up, so if you want to go now. it does kind of point out some of the things that NASA does. It also shows that there's kind of two sides of NASA. There's the kind of extremely staid sort of side, the headquarters side, the bureaucrat side. And then there's a lot of really innovative sorts of things going on, sometimes under the radar of headquarters. I'm going to guess that this got out under the headquarters of radar, under the radar headquarters. But sometimes some of this kind of like impromptu work, unofficial work, is often better than some of the stuff that, some of the official stuff. And there's actually quite a few cases where that happened. The first Mars rover, the Pathfinder, was actually based on a student project that was just a student came to NASA as an intern. They said, well, your project's not really ready, just hang out. And he said, well, can I have a couple $100 for parts? Yeah, sure. And so at the end of the summer, they still haven't given this project yet. So he said, well, I built this. And they said, holy cow, that can replace our $500 million rover. And that's how the current rover program got started. So let's see, you can see, well, I can see. Before we get too deep into this, I'm just trying to gauge how many people would be willing to go into space? Just a quick trip. Okay, quite a few. And how many of you would be willing to move to Mars?
Move to Mars.
Okay, good amount. And how many of you believe in space aliens? Space aliens.
In what format?
What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
It's an open-ended question.
We are space aliens, so I believe in us.
UFOs
are space aliens.
Okay, let's get a little bit further.
Space aliens on Earth.
How many of you have been contacted by space aliens? Abducted?
I mean, UFOs come from us, from White Sands in New Mexico. So.
I was going to say, if anyone had, then they're the person you want to talk to. They tell you good stuff. So, but there's actually, let's see, if I want to step back in a future day, and also want to thank Adam for kind of creating the space for this. I've been to several of his events. I've come to Melbourne, and it's great because there's different sorts of topics. You have all sorts of conversations. And as you probably noticed in real life, there aren't a lot of places you can have these kind of conversations. But he's created a space here. So I'd like to actually give a hand for him. This being Future Day, I might have to throw in a few of my own remarks, and they will be relevant to the presentation I'm giving. I'm guessing pretty much everyone's familiar with the exponential growth curve. You've probably seen these things, for instance, Moore's law for microprocessors, that sort of thing. So if you look at this as each unit of time, you can tell that the amount of change per unit of time, per day or per year, is getting greater and greater. And so we're not literally walking in the future, we're accelerating the future. The future is literally coming at us faster and faster and faster. Okay, so now there's a good reason for you to be here, in addition to just being interested in the future. I would argue this is good for your health. You've heard of life extension. Embracing the future helps you live longer. And how does it do that? Well, you may see stories such as this, like aging is linked to social status. Okay, well, knowledge is kind of power. Knowledge kind of moves you ahead. Knowledge moves you ahead of people who don't know the stuff you know. And with the future coming, there's all this change coming at an accelerating pace. And so if you're able to embrace that and keep up with it, you're going to kind of move ahead of the herd above people who don't keep up with it. And so this actually has physical health benefits, especially if you maintain a positive mental attitude about it. I'm not saying just blindly go into the future, but I think one great thing about environments such as this, and I'm also in a number of progressive groups, I'm involved in conservative groups, but there's a lot of people out there who have a very negative view of the future, and there certainly are reasons to be concerned, but I think you're much more empowered if you try to have a positive view of the future, with a grain of salt, of course, but you'll try to say there's challenges coming up, but let's make the best of things. And I think that's often what we're doing in this community. Okay, entertainment is a big part of space. And some people feel the future of space, I guess, aliens in South Africa, invasions. And so when you talk with people about space, these are some of the perceptions of space now or the future of space. These are actually events that will happen. And my mother told me this is the most terrifying movie she's ever seen. I said, like, you watch all these murder movies. She said, yeah, but the scary thing about this one is it could really happen. So there is a feeling out there, there is a kind of appreciation for space, and that our future may be tied in some way into space. Now, my home base in NASA is actually Ames Research Center. It's also where Singularity University is. I've been there kind of on and off on different projects for, it's embarrassing to say, like over 2 decades. And I've worked with the Wind Tunnel Group. I've worked on developing exoplanet atmosphere programs. Some of you, I see some gray hair in here. These are written in Fortran. Probably some of you have heard of Fortran. But you may think of Fortran as an ancient language, but it's still just about the fastest language out there. So we use it for a lot of the research modeling, especially stuff that you may want to do on a supercomputer. So Fortran's not the newest, but if you want the Ferrari to go the fastest, Fortran's it for a lot of what we're doing. The NASA Ames Research Center has a couple of things. I don't know how well you can see them. We have the largest wind tunnel in the world over here. I'm going to use feet. We're still in feet in the USA. This one is 120 by 90 feet. This one's 40 by 80. We have a lot of smaller wind tunnels around here. But that's kind of the past. We also have an airfield. So we do a lot of aeronautics work. But we're also kind of moving in the future with a lot of small satellite work, synthetic biology work, some of the things which I will refer to in this presentation. It's also located in the heart of Silicon Valley. So we're very tied into the electronics community and a lot of the new ventures. And I think that gives us a major advantage. But as an astronomer and physicist, when we're talking about future day, we look into the future, but we also have to go into the past. And astrophysicists have to go way, way into the past. And if you want to know the future, we're talking about trajectories. So to know a trajectory, you kind of have to know where you've been and kind of where you're going. So in the beginning, I don't know if you've seen this graphic before. It's a beautiful graphic. It's one of my favorite graphics. But there was the Big Bang 13.7 billion years ago. Those are metric years. In Old English years, I've heard it's about 6,000 years. And the universe expanded, and some interesting things happened. And I'm a thermodynamicist. Some of my research, actually much of my research is related to thermodynamics. And so you have some interesting things which I'll point out to you that may not be quite as obvious. When the universe expanded, it has roughly about the same amount of energy at this early point as over here. But the energy, as the universe expanded, became spread out over a much bigger area. So the universe has been cooling down. It's been getting cooler and cooler and cooler as the universe has been expanding. So isn't that kind of interesting? The average energy density of the universe has been decreasing. It's decreased substantially. Yet at the same time, due to things such as gravitational attraction, you have some of this matter kind of going into clumps. Okay, and a lot of this energy became clouds of gas, which compressed into stars. Clouds of gas, in addition, it became galaxies, things like that. In large-scale structures, you may be seeing photographs of filaments of galaxies. But the key thing is that you had them coming together and forming very compressed, condensed regions of energy. So you have this interesting situation where the universe is getting cooler, the average energy density is decreasing, and yet you have regions that have very, very high amounts of energy density. And so in addition, around some of these stars, you had some of this matter start condensing into dust, clouds of dust and rocks and things like that. The rocks collided into each other, became bigger rocks. More rocks collided, became planetoids. And so you actually had the planets of our galaxy, not our galaxy, of our solar system form. For instance, the Earth, Jupiter, things like that. Now you still have some of the small rocks. You have lots of asteroids. If one of them almost hit us, actually one of them did hit us a few weeks ago, hit Russia. Let's see. So looking at this thermodynamically, though, you can think of, came through kind of enough, where the sun is this highly concentrated ball of energy, and it's radiant energy because we have the cold of space, and you have this hot condensed area of energy, and so energy wants to flow, essentially high-level energy wants to degrade and flow into cold space. It's a simple Fourier's law, an analogy of Fourier's law if you remember your physics. And the Earth's in the middle of this flow, at least some of the flow, so you have this relatively high beta purple, which is a high wavelength type of light, hit the Earth. Things happen to that energy, and there some gets reflected, but a lot of it gets absorbed and re-radiated to infrared and then to cold space. And not only that, but the Earth itself has a great deal of radioactive material which is decaying. So the Earth is almost like a star in that it's producing its own source heat. Not nearly as much, of course. But so you have this heat inside the Earth, and it wants to get out into the cold part of space because remember, a thermodynamic potential exists. And so you have these interesting sorts of structures formed. These are actually deep sea vents that allow the heat from the Earth to get out faster than simple conduction would allow it to. And then you have that heat, in addition to the sunlight that's warmed up the Earth's surface, that wants to get back into space as quickly as possible. So infrared radiation is one method, but there's this kind of drive to kind of make this happen as quickly as possible. And so you have the formation of structures, such as clouds. And clouds are actually, if you know your physics, this is convection. So conductive cells are actually ways for the heat to get off the Earth's surface faster. Now, if you remember some thermodynamics, or even if you don't, I'll give you a quick review of it. Don't worry, this won't be a whole talk on thermodynamics, although I think it's fascinating myself. In physics, we have a classic heat engine. You can call it a Carnot engine, if you want, that essentially takes some heat. This might be a thing of hot water or fire or something in cold water or a cooling pond or the atmosphere, and allows heat to flow through a heat engine, which turns a wheel which does work. So this wheel can turn a milling machine, it can turn an electric generator, all sorts of things like that. It can do work. And so you use this potential difference, essentially, and you consume the potential difference and do work and make things. So, but what if you take the work from a heat engine and use that work to build another heat engine? Okay. And then you take the work from these two heat engines and use them to build two more heat engines. So essentially you have heat engines begetting heat engines or reproducing heat engines. Does this sound like anything you know you've heard of?
Perpetual motion machine.
I'm sorry?
Perpetual motion machine.
I think I can't hear.
Perpetual motion machine, or a planet. Not that I agree with it, but I'm just saying.
Well, it's not, and I'll go back to the previous slide because, like in this case, there's actually something getting used up. There's actually the source of energy, a potential thermodynamic is getting used up. And if the sun did not keep shining on the Earth, it would get used up on the Earth too. Processes would cease on the Earth. But the fact is, we do have this replenishment, so it isn't perpetual. But I can see why it would, it seems like it's a sort of a steady state sort of thing, so I can see why it would seem like it's a perpetual motion machine. Does anyone else have any feeling what this might be like? Is there any sort of analogy in nature that we see?
I thought rabbits on an island.
Rabbits on an island?
It's actually the financial lending model.
Indeed.
Trees?
But that's a whole other talk.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nuclear energy, like fission and.
Yeah, actually, decay is another good example. Yeah. Yeah. So all those are actually examples of this. I'm going to give one example. There are many. But for instance, the formation of life on Earth. If you think of the Earth as having all this high energy sunlight hitting it, some of it could bounce back into space. But nature wants to use up that energy faster. So complex structures such as living organisms go, and for instance, they make the surface of the Earth darker and use up this high quality energy, build biomass, and do things with it. So you have life growing and more advanced forms of life growing to use up this energy until human civilization formed. And human civilization could do complex things like build pyramids, but it could also organize an economy, organize agricultural lands, create widespread production systems, and increase efficiencies. But by increasing efficiencies, it was able to do more and expand more. So we actually increased the amount of energy used. You can see examples of where human civilization kind of increased the amount of agricultural land. The most stark one is in the desert, where you probably recognize these as irrigation patterns. And without human society, this would all be arid land, such as this, or maybe nearly fallow land. But instead, areas like this, as long as there's water to pump out and energy to do it, become darker. You can see that they're darker than non-utilized areas. And so that's high energy, quality energy getting used. And so civilizations have continued to advance until you come to like our current day, where we have literally global systems using resources, creating technologies, and advancing into the future. Okay, so we have our fairly advanced, by at least our standards, society, and that can take us, then that provides the platform for us to go into space. One of the first, rocketry was a very important part of space, and anyone can build a rocket. A kid can build a rocket. So you've probably built some little rockets. I don't mean even just model ones. You probably put together materials, your own materials to make rockets. But one of the first major advances in rocket technology was the liquid fuel rocket. You can turn those things on and off, so you can kind of divert them a little bit better. And Robert Goddard created that in 1926. And the next really big jump, rockets got better. The V2 was a much more advanced rocket in Germany during the Second World War. But the thing that really got everyone's attention was the Sputnik 1 in 1957. This was a satellite that actually orbited the Earth. Much beyond the terrestrial stage. And I'm going to go through a lot of slides, but I want you to kind of see the pattern almost as an animation, where we have satellites, and until recently they're getting bigger and bigger, more capable, but they're getting bigger and bigger till they're literally the size of city buses. So jumping ahead to human spaceflight, which is probably of interest to most of you. In the first astronaut, have you heard of the first astronaut, Wanhu? Okay. Wanhu had a bunch of rockets strapped to a chair and had 47 servants light all the rockets at once, and literally was launched into the sky. And since we never heard from Wanhu, at least as far as I've heard it, ever again, there's no reason to assume that the mission was not successful. I know people who would do that if there wasn't any other way to get up there. And you know, I might be tempted myself, I admit.
I tried it on Mythbusters.
Okay, the first person making a space and make it back was Yuri Gagarin in 1961. Some of you may have heard of Yuris Night. It's a night celebrated every about April to celebrate his launch into space as the first human into space and back again. And there may be something going on in Melbourne, which I strongly encourage you to participate in. They're fun events. Okay, another stage was the Mercury Program, where John Glenn was orbiting the Earth. Actually, the Russians did it first, but I have better photographs for John Glenn's trip, and that was 1962. Then, relatively rapidly, space programs advanced further into the Gemini program. This was the mid-1960s. And this is my favorite space program in a way. These are relatively modest-sized rockets. You know, they're the type of rockets used to launch nuclear bombs, essentially. But there's a bunch of them. They're not that expensive. But they could actually get people into space, do interesting things like rendezvous, set people up for spacewalks, that sort of thing. But really, this was just a step to, that's actually Ed White walking in space. A step to the next phase, to big, gigantic rockets that could launch a lot. So the Saturn V rocket came out in 1967, and it brought us to the moon. So the first moon landing was 1969. Does anyone know what this is a slide of? It's not, actually, this is not the first moon landing. Yeah, you can tell because the buggy's in there. That was in the later flights. But I thought it was cool because we had people up there that could actually get around. And some of that hardware is still there, I guess, for anyone to claim. Okay, Australia was a major part of the 60s space scene as well. Does anyone recognize any of these places or rockets?
White.
That's
Which one?
White Knight.
Yeah, so and this is actually at Woomera. The Woomera space range still exists. They're not launching quite as big rockets. These were the older rockets. That was actually kind of joint Australian-European project. And you can actually still see this today. Woomera has a rocket park. Has anyone been to the Woomera rocket park? Oh, okay. So, you know, okay. Yeah, you're seeing that. And anyway, I recommend it. It's really in the middle of nowhere, but once you're there, there's cool stuff. Okay, so then the next step was the space shuttle. And the space shuttle, like the Saturn V, had very heavy lift capability. Right now we do not have the capability, because the space shuttle no longer flies, to lift anything that heavy. One of the downfalls of the space shuttle, which I'm a little bit embarrassed to say was an area that I was involved with, we created great thermal resistant materials at Ames Research Center. And I wasn't a major creator, I was just involved with them and helped get additional applications out for them. But you've probably seen this astronaut ice cream. Yeah. And this bricks on the space shuttle have kind of about the same strength as this ice cream. And I didn't even mean to break it, but it just broke, I think, carrying it over here. And I'll just pass it, so you can like feel, unfortunately all my real space shuttle stuff's back in the USA. But it actually feels a lot like this type of astronaut ice cream, except you can't eat it. You don't really want to be around it when it's being made. It's supposedly non-toxic, but I always feel kind of weird when I'm there when it's being made. Let's see, if I eat too much of the ice cream, then yeah, then I have. Okay, kind of the final stage of where we're at, or nearly the final stage, is the International Space Station. And this is a gigantic structure. I mean, if you can see, each one of these was little things launched on the space station. In addition, there's these larger, actually that's the Russian part of it, larger Russian modules, for instance, little things launched on the space shuttle, and huge solar cells. And so this is literally a city in space, although the population is relatively small. So, but one of the biggest challenges in the space station is trying to provide enough power. We have solar cells, but the amount of power available to the space station is actually a lot less than you might think it would be. One of the reasons I put this slide up here, though, is that not only was this a technological achievement, it is also a social achievement. This is a truly international space station, and to have countries such as the US, Russia, and in Europe, countries that can't even agree on their finances these days, to get together, build and maintain something like this up in the sky for decades, I feel is a tremendous social achievement, and I think it bodes well for the future of humanity, at least our ability to do these sorts of things together. And the Chinese may become involved in the next few years as well, I've heard. But right now, the Chinese do have their own space station, or they have part of a space station up there, just a small piece. They want to build it out to this. They began launching people in 2003. In terms of non-manned space stations, I should acknowledge India. Both Koreas are launching rockets. Japan has rockets. Brazil actually has a fairly lively unmanned space program. And of course, ESA is launching quite a bit of stuff as well, but they're part of their national space station. Kind of moving into future stuff is we're going to try to get people back into space again. And you can kind of tell the types of programs we have were kind of like big government programs. And the next step in the big government program is deep space exploration. So they want to build a heavy boost rocket, something that could perhaps match the Saturn V, or at least something in that ballpark, much more than we've got now. And they're going to try to put people in the Orion capsule. Now, the original Mercury was really tight. It was almost like the size of a phone booth. The Gemini capsule was almost 2 phone booths stuck together. The Apollos were relatively luxurious. They had 2 levels, so the astronauts could, like, if they got sick and tired, generally go to the lower level, for instance. It wasn't a big lower level, but in space things feel bigger. But I don't know if you can see it, but they actually have people packed in layers over here. So I believe this can actually fit up to 6 people. And if you're going to Mars, you're stuck in something like this for a year. I'm dedicated to space. I don't know if I would want to do that, but I probably could be talked into it. Let's see, so they've actually built prototypes, at least they're testing prototypes. The hope is to build a base on Mars, and presumably this will be an international effort, although I don't think ESA is committed to it yet. I could be wrong on that. And you tell some of the elements of this. There's talk of actually putting people in caves or these sorts of structures, because radiation in space is a really big problem. One of the things is that we're still biological organisms, and there's a question whether to send robots into space or humans into space. And it's a really tough call, because as humans, we want to be in space, we want to be doing these sorts of things, but our bodies just aren't really well adapted to it. But you see some of the other neat sort of things happening where there's mostly low gravity, but there is an atmosphere on Mars, so you can have conceivably gliders, and some of these can be solar-powered gliders. And as I mentioned, people could live in caves to avoid the radiation, but still have their greenhouses to grow the plants out here. So there have been a couple of good Mars movies that kind of talk about bases on Mars. Now the thing is with Mars movies is usually the first half of or 2/3 is pretty reasonably scientific, and a good representation of some of the things that might happen someday. And then the last third invariably involves space aliens and way out there stuff, which may be into, but you almost have to separate these things into two different types of movies, even though they're the same movie. Kind of the dream, and I was kind of telling you about how we're trying to, how the universe wants us to use up more and more sunlight and do things with it, and humanity is kind of like an instrument in that. And so people have proposed building these huge solar power satellites in space. This would be an example where you have presumably the space light coming in at different angles and then being beamed back through things such as microwaves or lasers back to the Earth. And this would not produce as much global warming as burning, for instance, carbon fuels. If these were fairly durable craft, this would be a renewable source of energy. Hopefully these things would be up there, last hopefully will have the energy to propel themselves, and could be a good long-term source of energy. Now going way into the future, if you take this, and you could maybe have a few of these around the Earth, but what if you want to use even more and more of the sun's light? So you can probably see where I'm going with this. If you have the sun in the middle, you can actually build mirrors or collectors all around the sun until you actually have a whole shell around the sun. Now, a real shell would be dynamically unstable, but you could constantly have combinations or structures, or if you have advanced materials, maybe you could overcome those instabilities, I don't know, where you could essentially surround the sun, use all of its light, and there's a theory that alien civilizations may be already doing this. As part of the search for extraterrestrial life is actually looking for these infrared sources, because if you cover the star, you won't be able to see the visible light, but the heat has to go somewhere. That's basically also thermodynamics. If you have the energy heat collecting in place, eventually it's just going to get hotter and hotter, but eventually it's going to start radiating. And so you see these kind of like otherwise unexplained infrared sources. And so there are actual surveys, not large surveys, but there are some surveys going on for this right now. So, so that's kind of the future in terms of energy use in space, and the future of big giant programs. And even these space solar power programs are asking for a lot of money. I've done some studies on them, and even if you brought launch costs down to zero, given current space technology, these would still be very expensive in terms of the price of energy, bringing the energy to Earth, which is unfortunate because I like the concept, but we're just not there in terms of our technology yet. But things may change. But the big government programs are going away, not going away immediately, but they're slowly kind of winding down. In the US, tomorrow we face sequestration, and that is going to actually reduce NASA funds. And the fact is that, I don't know how it is in Australia, but in the US, healthcare costs are skyrocketing. Okay, my small business health insurance premiums, even though I haven't made a claim in like a decade, went up 50% last year, and they went up 35% the year before, and they've been going up and up and up. At this rate of increase, in 10 years, my insurance premiums will be $16,000 a month. So Australian or US, take it either way. That's kind of the power of exponential growth. But the thing is that since people had these huge costs, healthcare costs, and I noticed even my Australian premiums went up 5% this year, or at least in the last round they raised it. We have less and less money for space, so people don't want to pay as much taxes. Your middle class, your poor classes just don't have as much money to pay taxes. So that takes money away from the government space programs. Another trend is that businesses have become global, so it's easier for businesses, particularly high-tech businesses, to move their money around the globe to avoid taxation. There was a story, this is an older story, but where Citibank, to avoid reserve requirements, you've probably heard this story, where they would wire their transfers, as soon as, right before the close of business in like the United States, they might send it over to Hong Kong, and right before the end of the business day there, they might send it over to India, and so their reserves would literally circle around the world to avoid, having to be in any one place. And so the same thing is kind of happening with taxes as well. So this revenue source for big government programs is still partly there. It's not going to go away immediately, but it certainly isn't nearly as large as it used to be. Okay, but some of these people who have been avoiding paying taxes, not completely, but and have been doing these big high-tech ventures have a whole lot of money to spend on space now. And whether or not you like it this way, it's happening. And like I said, change is coming. You know, we can fight the stuff we don't like, but the stuff we can't, you know, change, let's try to make the best of it. And this has been a major silver lining for space. A lot of the founders, or I shouldn't say a lot, but several of the founders, some of the biggest high-tech companies, were actually in student space clubs at university. One of them was Students for the Exploration and Development of Space. I think it's kind of like the counterpart of the ASSA in Australia. And some of these people included Elon Musk, who was a co-founder of PayPal, Pierre Diamandis, who was the founder of the X Prize, Jeff Bezos, who was the founder of Amazon.com. You can kind of get the idea. And now the Google guys are into this stuff as well. So, and they literally have billions of dollars to spend on space stuff. And they want to go. You know, I mean, if NASA, you know, can't take them there, they're going to create their own rockets. So the most famous example of this, and I'm sure some of you have heard of this, is the Falcon 9 rocket by SpaceX. And that actually successfully launched the Dragon capsule to the space station, resupply the space station with supplies. Okay, so this is already happening. Someone is literally, a private company has built their own rocket, their own pressurized capsule to get to the space station, and they've done it surprisingly quickly, and the things work pretty well. But they don't plan on just delivering supplies. They're actually creating a human, a version of the Dragon capsule for a human crew, and this is an example of that. Another group is working on mining for gold, literally in the asteroids. And I have some asteroid samples. Of course, I'll need these back, but if you want to look at some of the, because I borrowed them, they're not mine. The ones on the left are examples of asteroidal materials. So you have, you can tell one of them is a pretty high-grade metal. The other one isn't, but it has other sorts of useful materials in it. And with the price of gold literally itself increasing exponentially, it's almost as worthwhile, and it may soon be worthwhile, to actually go and pull this stuff out of asteroids, and then once you find it, and then bring it back to the Earth and sell it. So, and this is actually a firm, but they're smart. They're not necessarily spending the huge amounts of money to get it done as quickly as possible. With the Apollo program, we had to get that done by the end of the decade because President Kennedy had died, and there's kind of a monument to President Kennedy, among other things. And so there's this big time squeeze, but there isn't that. So they're going to begin in small stages, and Chris Wilkie is, I believe, the director, he's the chief technologist anyway, for this. And so they're actually going to start building these little satellites to start prospecting for the gold. And then once they find it, then they're going to start building rockets to send it there to go to the asteroids. So they're getting in for roughly low investment. They've got some proprietary information about, you know, what's out there that they can then pitch for much bigger investments and then go out there and actually start harvesting. There's ownership issues like who actually owns these asteroids and things like that. And who knows, there may be, you know, they may not be allowed to go mine these sort of things, but right now they're trying. Another thing which you may have heard.
That was going to stop me.
When they come back and be arrested. So.
What we do?
I mean,
so rich they'll just pay the fine.
Well, I hope it works out. I hope everyone's going to cooperate with them. That's their assumption, and I'm going to live with it. I mean, I've been investing money, so I'm going to live with that assumption. One of the things you may have seen on the moon is the Mars swing by. You've probably seen this sort of thing. Or Dennis Tito, he was actually kind of a commercial astronaut where he flew to go to the space station and take some photographs. He wants to send a couple to Mars by 2018. Now, in a way, this isn't really the future. This is almost just kind of a stunt. You're going to take this craft and literally fly it by the moon. It's going to circle around the moon literally once, very similar to the Apollo 8 mission, and then come back to the Earth. So as far as exploration goes, as far as where it's going, I'm not sure that's really a big deal. But what will be important about this is life support. They're going to be out there for, I heard it's like 500 days going there, about 500 days going back. So you're going to actually have people exposed to the radiation in space, the low gravity, the microgravity of space for that whole amount of time. And so I view this almost as more of a biomedical project, but hopefully we'll capture the imagination. And this is a relatively cheap way for space tourists. So if you want to go to Mars, this may be a relatively inexpensive way. You won't be able to set foot on Mars, but you'll be able to say, ooh, I went to Mars, I got to see, it's kind of cool. And for a lot of people, you know, that's important. So you're thinking, you know, you got the high-tech billionaire boys club. So this is, but maybe you want to get involved yourself, or, how can you get involved, or do you have to be a billionaire? I'm not saying don't go out there and found the next, Google or Facebook, it's a good way to do these things. But there's actually a whole new revolution in space for the financially impaired. And you can each literally have your own space program. This is an example of kind of a CubeSat, and there's a whole movement to build these little satellites. They're getting smaller and smaller and more capable. Remember I was telling you that under the old program, the satellites were getting bigger and bigger, the size of buses. Well, now a lot of these satellites are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And not only that, but they're using things like off-the-shelf hardware. And I don't know how many of you have seen Arduino controllers, but the thing on the left is actually something you can use to control a satellite. I'll just pass that around. And you can buy these things for $20. If you're willing to spend like maybe $150, you can actually buy one of these to control a UAV, an unmanned aerial vehicle. And they're making these for satellites, so you'll be able to literally build your own satellite. And a lot of it will be pre-built. Or there's a case where in the UK they're actually using a mobile phone, an iPhone to control one of these satellites. They won't exclusively control it, but it's showing how this technology is getting more and more into the hands of ordinary people. And since these satellites are so small, you don't need a big, huge rocket to launch them. Often you can catch a ride on someone else's rocket, or there may be relatively small rockets you'll be able to launch them directly on, although it'll be a lot more expensive. But we may be getting there. Another part of what's making this possible is kind of a revolution in funding due to the internet. It's called crowdfunding. How many people here have heard of crowdfunding? Okay, just about everyone, which is great. So this company, NanoSatisfy, which was also called Arduous at the same time, it's kind of related, used crowdfunding. And they were one of the biggest crowdfunding successes for Kickstarter, one of the major crowdfunding companies. They raised $106,000. And now the founder, Peter Platzer, put a lot of his own money into this as well, but not millions and millions of dollars. It's more like, even like I think about 100,000 of his own money or so. But the thing is, he just went and sat with people. We had lunch, and he would just meet with a lot of people, promote this thing at Kickstarter, use word of mouth, and essentially raise a company where he's going to have his own satellites up there. And if you don't have money to get your own satellite, you can rent time on one of his satellites. So for a few $100s, a grade school, for instance, or a scientist can get time on one of these satellites. That's what I'm saying. Literally anyone in this room can have their own space program, can do things in space. Maybe you can't physically get up there yet, but you can actually start doing things there. And the day may be coming when you can get up there for not necessarily millions of dollars, but for thousands or hundreds of thousands. You can do a zero gravity flight for $5,000 or $3,500. You get the discount. And one of the things they've been doing with the zero gravity flights is there's a couple of guys who, and a couple of women in this one as well, formed a company called Made in Space. You've heard of 3D printing, and do I have my 3D printing sample over here somewhere? Well, if there's a blue, kind of a cheap-looking blue printed thing around here, is that back there? Is there a little blue case back there? Some pieces. If you get past those around, if you've never seen anything that's been printed 3D, now this is not a great example. This is just something we made at the lab. Yeah, we made it in the lab late at night. It's a case actually for our Arduino controller. The quality on these things can be very, very good. It can be just as good as anything, pretty much as good as anything you can injection mold. And it can make parts that are much more complicated. And it's also possible to print in a variety of metals. So you can print all sorts of parts. And so say you are up in the space station or your own space station or ISS, and you need a part. Theoretically, to have replacement parts for everything up in the space station, you'd have to have thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of parts. That's a lot of parts. But with a 3D printer, as long as you have the basic materials, you can print whatever part you need because you can some wire up the computer file and make it. But can we do? Sorry?
But it only prints plastic.
No, there's metal ones out here too. Yeah, they're more expensive and they aren't quite as versatile, but they're getting better.
How does that look different?
And so this company Made in Space, though, is pointing out that, well, the existing 3D printers maybe don't work so well in space, in zero gravity or microgravity. So they're actually creating this three-dimensional printer, and they're able to get small amounts of government funding to get this thing started. They could have gone through Kickstarter, but they're able to get, I think, about $50,000 or $100,000 for a government grant. And from this company, actually build printers that work in space. And in a few years, I believe their printer and maybe one of them will be sent to the space station to actually try it out and make things over there. Okay, now this brings an important point in that Australia is, the Australian government, I think, is willing to write checks for like $100,000 now. It used to be 50,000. People who have good ideas who want to start businesses. Now I know there are conditions on those, but is anyone familiar with that program? I'd like to pitch it for a minute or two. Okay, but the thing is, you don't just have to be in the US to start a company like this. You can actually start these things in Australia, and in some ways it's easier to get money in Australia for these things, small amounts of money, like $100,000, than it is in the US. One of the most exciting areas, remember we're talking about heat engines that can build heat engines. And this is literally going back into the future again. And this is going to be one of the biggest areas in space. And one of the newest areas is synthetic biology, where you bioengineer organisms to do all sorts of things that it's really hard to have machines to do. Because the great thing about bioorganisms is they can make each other pretty easily. 3D printers can print part of 3D printers, but they can't really print a whole 3D printer. They're not good at printing the microchips and things like that. If you were trying to make more and more 3D printers in space, you could use local materials like Martian materials or lunar regolith to make part of it, but you'd still need to ship up the chips. With organisms, as long as you have the basic materials of life up there, they can make themselves, and they can do all sorts of things. Here's kind of examples of things. For instance, if you take lunar regolith and you then find volatiles, and there's all sorts of materials on in space that you can use this. You can use these organisms to essentially make this adhesive to make bricks and materials out of lunar regolith, large-scale things. So you actually build structures. I think these are habitats made of perhaps this lunar regolith material, and these are pretty bulky things. So it may be somewhat better at blocking radiation, almost like living in a cave, but without shipping all that material into space. Same thing, you may be able to optimize food production. You may be able to create air, atmospheric stuff. So you can use life to create the elements of life. Right now, this is a relatively small thing, but you will probably be hearing more and more about this within the next 5 to 10 years. The spaceships and SpaceX are pretty exciting, but this has the potential, doesn't have much money yet, but this has the potential to do things that will literally blow our minds. You may be able to create organisms that are especially designed for space, and maybe even big animals are especially designed for space. So instead of building a robot, or you may be able to bioengineer humans to be able to perhaps handle the radiation better to go into space. So going to planetary systems, I know I'm kind of shooting for my time, but we're getting toward the end. Space is more than just sending people into space. It's also about going to planets and discovering things, a lot of times with robots. So anything but the Earth is with robots right now. But kind of some of the materials for synthetic biology we've actually been finding around the solar system using rovers and various probes. You've heard of water on Mars. They haven't found any really surface water that's in liquid form, but they found things that look like they're water that's moved, bits of dirt around. They've seen things like ice. They think they found water underneath the surface of it. But even more than water, in addition, methane has been found in the atmosphere of Mars, and it varies in level. So fresh methane is being produced on Mars. Could that be from life? We don't know. But methane has carbon, has hydrogen, so that's also another useful material for making things. There's, I don't have a photo of it, but there's been ice, or at least we think there's ice, and maybe a lot of ice and organic materials in the polar regions of the moon, so relatively close by. So you go to the moon, do these things there as well. One of the biggest sources of water beyond the Earth are the ocean moons of Jupiter. There's ice on the surface, but we think that there may be oceans underneath. And evidence of that is that the ice seems to be cracking and shifting, which it would if there was water underneath. If hydrocarbons are what you're looking for, there could be literally hydrocarbon oceans on Titan, a moon of Saturn. And the question is there actual life out there? Anyone recognize what planet this is from? It's a good question. It looks like Mars. It's one of the coolest graphics I have, but it's actually the Earth. It's a salt flat. And there, in some of these salt flats in extreme environments, like the hydrothermal vents I've showed you, there's organisms that can withstand much more extreme conditions than things that just ordinarily crawl on land that we would encounter, such as ourselves, for instance. They can handle high levels of salt, high levels of heat, high levels of cold. And this is practical. In addition, the study of extremophiles has actually led to much of our advance in biotechnology. There's a process in biology where they take DNA. For instance, you have some DNA from a crime scene, just a tiny bit, not necessarily do tests, but if you put this to a process called PCR, it essentially takes the DNA and it's a photocopier for DNA, in a sense, not a photocopier, but copies it. So you can put a little bit of DNA, it'll create lots and lots of that same identical DNA. And the essentially the enzyme that makes it possible, not really a biologist, let's just say the compound that makes it possible, was actually derived from an extremophile. So another example of life that may be in the universe is there were rocks found on the Earth that we are fairly certain were from Mars, and they have little structures that could have been from bacteria. You know, we're certainly not certain it's from bacteria. There's some scientists who claim strongly that it's not from bacteria. But there's some hope that curiosity will actually find evidence of past life and be able to, confirm or reject that hypothesis. So going further beyond the solar system is the big exoplanet discovery. The early discoveries were made of planets around main sequence stars, 1995, 1996. It was kind of exciting because a lot of times in research, you have the discoveries made by people at the big, huge, giant schools, Stanford, Harvard, MIT, for instance. But the discoveries of these planets were made simultaneously by some researchers in Switzerland, not from a big, gigantic school, and also from my home university at the time, San Francisco State University, and that was Jeff Marcy. And essentially, he would take a few grad students, undergrads, and they would take these plates and put them in their dark room, and over a period of years, they gathered evidence of exosolar planets. The early exoplanets that they discovered, and this is kind of an important distinction, why haven't we found things that look just like Earth out there? Why has it taken so long? The way they detect these things typically is by the wobble of the star. There may be a star the planet's orbiting, and if it's a large planet, the larger the planet, the more wobble it's going to have on the star. And the closer it is to the star, the more wobble it's going to have on the star as well. So what type of planets were you going to discover first? Big giant planets, big giant Jupiters that may be like 5, 6, 10 times Jupiter mass, really, really close to their star. You'll get the biggest wobble and you'll get the fastest wobble, so you won't need as many years or as long of a time to confirm, because they can't just do one orbit of the star, of the planet around the star. They have to do several orbits to really have a good amount of confidence. But you'll see this is an example of a Jupiter, and it has all sorts of atmospheric phenomena that look like a Jupiter. And a lot of times these things, and this is where some of the research where I was involved with, is these things kind of border on being brown dwarfs, which are stars that don't support helium fusion, and big giant Jupiter planets. And so we're using similar models to see what's in the atmosphere, to see whether there's water in these sorts of things. And those are the ones that are running on Fortran. Another technique for exoplanets, and this is my favorite technique because you can see atmospheres with it, is when a planet goes in front of a star, you can see that the light will diminish. This is not to scale, really, but it gives you an idea. The light will diminish somewhat and then go back up. And so we can then get some of the characteristics of the planet. In addition, we can sometimes see a little bit into the edges of the atmosphere, and we can figure out maybe what types of things are in the atmosphere, at least in the upper layers of the atmosphere. Okay. Okay, let's wrap up. So the search for habitable planets is we're trying to get planets that are further away from the star, as well as that are smaller and smaller, because those are the types of things that will be in the habitable zone where life could conceivably exist. And then we can try to search for extraterrestrial intelligence there. If they look like promising candidates, we may be able to send probes and eventually people there. And this is the holy grail of space, in that to try to find Earth-like planets that may support life, that may support interesting sorts of things, or that people could eventually go to. Now this is the last slide. You'll be happy to know. And I just want to kind of address some of the challenges for the future of space. One of the challenges which I'm most interested or most concerned about is kind of like the dynastic sort of pattern that societies get into, kind of the rise and fall. And the United States may be going through a transition time, and it may be in conflict with other countries that are going through a different phase. And so can these countries support these types of space programs, or are we going to have global conflicts that will make these type of programs very difficult or move everything into military space? We're more concerned with bombing each other than exploration.
Surely it was a global conflict. It was the greatest promoter for space travel. I mean, Russia and America.
There weren't that many nuclear bombs dropped. I'm worried this time nuclear bombs will be sent. Not maybe they might not be destroyed, but another one more to home, and I had a little bit of agenda in this talk, is Australia, as of yet, does not have a true space agency. And there are a number of Australians who are trying to push for a space agency and even get a minimal level of funding. Say just $1 per year per person would be 20 million, which isn't a huge amount, but you could use that to leverage into about 60 million. Have a small satellite program, have a small rocket program. You've got a lot of the elements of a space program. You have the largest wind tunnel in the southern hemisphere over at Menashe Clayton. You have one of the largest rocket ranges in the world at Woomera. You do have space technology. There's a group at University of New South Wales, for instance, at UNESA. You actually have a lot of the pieces. It really won't be that hard or that expensive to weave it into. It just really takes a political will to do it on a sustained basis. And so that's just something I wanted to throw out there. And that is the end of the talk, and I will stick on for questions. Thank you.
Excellent. We've got like time for a couple of questions, as long as they're like not monologues and like a question in 3 or 4 volumes. Is there anybody out there who wants to ask a question who hasn't really asked a question before? Just asking, because I know some people might be a bit shy. Okay, over there.
Yeah, are you familiar with Dennis Tyler, who's the first space tourist who's planning to go to Mars?
Yes, in fact, that graphic I showed was his craft, his proposed craft.
2018 mission. Do you think the
Yes.
likelihood of his success or even getting that contributing 72?
Technically, it's possible. It's a question of do they want to spend the money, especially up front early on where they need to develop the stuff.
Because he's only got like 200 million or something, not billions or, something.
Yeah, he's not one of the more, he's not one of the wealthier space enthusiasts out there. I don't know, I wouldn't rule it out though. The one thing that's more feasible about his is that you can use existing technology, or at least nearly existing technology, and it's just going to do a swing by. So it's really going to be a lot less expensive than you think it would be.
Why don't we kind of do a colony on Mars? I mean, why don't we do one on the Moon? It seems a lot closer, and you might be able to make a bit of money out of it.
Those are good questions. The people I know who are enthusiasts are much more enthusiastic about Mars. Mars has somewhat more gravity. What are some of the other advantages of Mars? It has more of an atmosphere. Another thing is that Mars probably has a lot more water than the Moon does. But I think the Moon's a reasonable candidate. One other issue about the Moon is that Mars has a day cycle that's similar to the Earth. The Moon has a much slower rotational cycle due to being kind of caught in the Earth's gravity. And so the temperature extremes tend to be much more on the Moon. They're almost as bad as on Mercury. So that's a disadvantage.
There are already proposals to mine the Moon.
Well, yeah, there are bases, they plan on putting bases over there. Elon Musk wants to go there himself, and maybe he'll want to stay a while. Using these structures of lunar regolith, and then using some of these volatiles that are there, you could actually build structures that could be like caves, that could withstand the heat, that could overcome a lot of the challenges.
Excellent. So, put your hands together for Mark.